HB 2337. So we're going to go ahead and open that up and turn it over to the reviser, Jason, for a brief explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason Thompson, Revisor's Office. You have House Bill 2337 and the bill brief from our office. It's kind of lengthy, so I won't go into too much detail. You've got conferees that can dig into it a little bit more. This bill imposes a fee on each international transaction by a money transmitter by wire. It also allows the state bank commissioner to assess penalties for the non-payment of that fee. It provides for the distribution of the fee and penalty monies, and to do that, it establishes some funds: the Criminal Litigation Fund, the Wire Transfer Fee Fund, and the Prosecutor and Law Enforcement Grant Fund. It also finally creates a misdemeanor crime of unlawful transmission of a wire transfer. So just to kind of give you where those provisions are located, and if you want to find them and dig into them a little bit more, Section 1 is the new section of law that provides for the money transmitter by wire fee. It is $7.50 for each international transaction of $500 or less, and it's an amount equal to 1.5% of any international transaction in excess of $500. Their money transmitters are required to, money transmitter by wire, that term, those folks are required to file monthly reports and returns with the Director of Taxation, and then they are also required to pay those fees in that can then be used as a tax credit later, that we'll get to. The fund distribution is also in Section 1. As I mentioned, there are 3 funds established. So the first, the amount that comes in from the fees that is paid into the Treasury first go to the tax credits that are allowed under Section 5. Then the balance of the monies goes 30% to the Criminal Litigation Fund that's established in Section 2, 45% to the Wire Transfer Fee Fund that's established in Section 3, and finally 25% to the Prosecutor and Law Enforcement Grant Fund established in Section 4. So there's your distribution of funds, kind of SGF for tax credits, then 30%, 45%, 25% in the following sections. Section 2 then establishes one of those funds. The Criminal Litigation Fund is used for the costs of investigating and prosecuting criminal cases, except that it's not going to be used for any activities related to the Medicaid Fraud and Abuse Division. They have their own funding, so I think that's why that's carved out specifically. Section 3 is the Wire Transfer Fee Fund. Those funds are used for complex drug and white-collar criminal investigations. And then Section 4 is that Law Enforcement Grant Fund. That one's administered by the Kansas Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, and it will be for grants to county attorneys or district attorneys or local law enforcement agencies for justice assistance purposes. Section 5 then is the tax credit provisions. I really won't get into that much, not a tax reviser, so that's all there. That would explain how those tax credits would work. And then finally, Section 6 is the crime of unlawful transmission of a wire transfer. This is a simple, fairly straightforward crime of acts done by a person who is not a United States citizen or an alien who is lawfully present in the United States. They are not allowed to send or receive a wire transfer, deposit money in a financial institution for the purpose of sending a wire transfer, and they're not allowed to withdraw the proceeds of a wire transfer. Those are all Class C non-person misdemeanors. That's Section 6. And then the final section is Section 7. That's the definition section. And there are a couple of definitions there related to money transmitter by wire. And the main thing I'd point out is there's a long list of exceptions from that definition. It does not include depository institutions, and the United States government, the Kansas government. So there's a whole list of exceptions from the definition. And I said finally, I keep saying that because I want it to be the final one. There's one more section at the very end, and it's just about confidentiality of documents and information from the Secretary of Revenue. There's an amendment there just to facilitate kind of the transferring of all of the information between the Department of Revenue and the State Banking Commissioner to facilitate the tax credits and implement this program. So with that, that's finally, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you for that, Jason. Committee, do we have any questions for Jason? See, now, Jason, I have one. I hate to do this to you because you referenced you're not a tax reviser. I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around, okay, we're sending how much of this fee collected to the treasurer's office for the tax credit? And then from there, how are we figuring out how much of that is getting distributed into these other accounts? Because from what I understand, the tax credit can be rolled over if it doesn't meet the liability of the taxpayer. So how is that mechanism working, I guess?
Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. So I'll go over the things that I can tell from just the language. So the first portion of the fee, it says in section 1, goes into the state general fund, and it shall be used, the amount equal to the amount of tax credits allowed under section 5 for the immediately preceding year as certified by the Director of Taxation. So the Director of Taxation is supposed to certify the amount of the tax credits that should be available, and
The
that
previous
amount
year.
is set aside.
Okay.
And then, so, yeah, so that provision, let's see if I can find it actually in the bill. It's new section 1, subsection E, which is page 2, line 11. That's where all the fee breakdown happens, right? So the first chunk is supposed to be sort of reserved in SGF for the tax credits, and then the remainder goes to those other funds. And you're right, the tax credits, I do note in the brief in section 5, you are allowed a tax credit equal to the amount of fees paid pursuant to section 1 during the tax year, and the credit cannot exceed your tax that's imposed on you, but you can roll it over, and it looks like it expires after the 5th tax year, so it does roll over for a few years. And so that's what I can tell. And I don't know how that'll work. I guess it would take a few years before the amount held for tax credits might trickle to those other funds. That might be the mechanics.
If I'm under, and the assumption will absolutely be wrong, but if I'm just starting from the assumption that all wire transfers are legal and being sent and would be collected, the fees would be collected back on the tax credits, just kind of how that mechanism's working on, if we're divvying out these fees to these other funds, but we still owe these tax credits. And that's under the assumption, again, which I believe the director will explain to us, is not necessarily the case. 100% of these won't be collected because there are some possibly illegal activities coming from these, so.
And Mr. Chairman, the only thing I would say is that, there's, with tax credits, right, they could be unclaimed, or they could exceed the tax that the transmitter by wire should pay. And so there might be more sitting there than needs to be, claimed for the credit. And I think either way, like at some point, if they're not claimed after 5 years and not used, then that money would certainly roll to those funds. But there's maybe a possibility in the interim as well, so.
I appreciate that, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Jason. Okay, I just got a little confused. My coffee probably hasn't kicked in yet, so bear with me. The tax credit that is used against the fees is for the individuals who have international wire transfers and then has to pay that fee, and then that's the tax credit towards that? Or can you explain that? I totally misunderstood.
Mr. Chairman and Representative, Coffee, I'm with you. All right, no, and if I misspoke, I apologize to the committee because I don't know that I was clear on that. The tax credit is for the money transmitter by wire, so the business. So the business imposes the fee, and then they get a tax credit for paying that fee in, I suppose, but it's not the individual. The individual just pays the fee.
And so, if I can have one more question. So I'm guessing the intent of it is, obviously you probably can't speak to this and maybe the proponents can speak to it, is the tax credit is then to kind of erase then the cost of the transfer?
Yeah, if we could look at that a little closer, because maybe I'm misinterpreting this, and the director, I believe the tax credit is for the individual and not the business. It wouldn't make sense for the business to collect the fee, remit it, and then the business get the tax credit for it, because that's just giving the business that money. I believe the fee, the tax credit, will go to the individual paying the wire fee.
Mr. Chairman, I'll double check because I may have missed.
I believe the director can get that into that too. And Jason, if you want to just dig into that a little bit, and we can turn back to you here after we hear from the director. But I believe that's at least the intent of this, is the individual is the one that gets to claim the tax credit, almost like a refund for paying that fee.
Mr. Chairman, you're right. It specifically says the amount of fees paid, right? So that if, yeah, the business wouldn't be paying them. So yeah, I just keyed on the wrong word there. My apologies. Yeah, so it would be for the individual. So every individual would have to claim this tax credit, and that would lead to a much different pool of funds than if the business were doing this. Yep, so coffee, thank you.
Coffee all around. Thanks,
Representative
Jason.
Williams, does
Thank
that-
you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Committee, any other questions for Jason? He's begging you not to. Representative McDonald.
Just real quick, I know that when I buy pharmaceuticals, I get a statement from Walgreens telling me that. Is there something like that set up so that it's not on the person paying the fee to keep up with how many times they paid $7.50 each transfer?
So, Mr. Chairman and Representative, the only thing that I can see for sure is on page 1 in line 16 and 17, you get a receipt for the fee each time you pay it. So the customer is going to get a receipt that says what the fee they paid was. And I guess with all other tax information, you'll just have to save your receipts and be ready to claim those credits.
Representative Rivas.
Yeah, I'm just trying to follow the money. So question is that you got the three funds that money's being directed towards, but later it talks about the Department of Revenue needs about $1 million. So is that additional money the Department of Revenue is going to be asking for from the State General Fund, or is that money as part of these collections that are coming in?
Mr. Chairman, I'm guessing that is from the fiscal note, which I have not reviewed. I don't see any money going to the Department of Revenue. I see money being allocated for the tax credits and then money being allocated to the three funds that have their purposes. So if there's additional money that revenue is claiming, I'm not seeing it allocated in the bill, and that would be a
Follow up on that.
fiscal question.
Yeah, it's in the note here. It says Department of Revenue indicates that we require a total of $990,599 from the general fund, including $222,000 for three customer representative positions. So he goes on to explain that. So I guess from my perspective, if it's going to generate $12 million, that money could be directed from there. It's just a thought. I'm just wanting to make sure where the cash flow is going.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, no, that's a good question. I know there's been some discussion that you'll probably hear about maybe that's the one piece that's not allocated in the funding, right? All of that is accounted for, but maybe not the expenses of revenue or the state bank commissioner. So that would be, we could always add a fourth distribution, but right now it's not in the bill as far as I can tell.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none. Thank you so much, Jason. Alrighty, we're going to open it up for proponent testimony. We have Tony Mativi up, Director of the Kansas Bureau of Investigations. Director Mativi, welcome to committee, sir.
Better? Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Chair, thank you. Members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you. I understand this committee may not be used to typically hearing about criminal justice issues, but that is exactly what this bill is. You might not think that this bill is related to the number of people being murdered in Kansas every single day by Mexican drug cartels trafficking fentanyl into our state. But please bear with me as I walk you through the reasoning behind this bill, and that's exactly what it is. Fentanyl poisonings, what we used to call fentanyl overdoses, are the leading cause of death of Americans under 40. Let that sink in for a minute. Fentanyl poisonings are killing more Americans under 40 than any other single cause in our country right now. More than gun violence, more than automobile accidents, more than suicides. Across this country, we lose the equivalent of one airliner filled with passengers each day. Every single day in this country, that's how many people die from fentanyl poisonings. Of those, juveniles, meaning under 18, there are more than 30 across the country every single day. That's one classroom filled with children that we lose in this country every single day from fentanyl poisonings. Here in Kansas, last year, we lost about 1 Kansan a day. 1 a day, just in Kansas, from fentanyl poisoning. Here's the thing that you need to know about the fentanyl that's being sold in Kansas. There is not a single fentanyl pill that's trafficked into this state that isn't ultimately attributable to one of 2 major Mexican drug cartels. 2 Mexican drug cartels are responsible for all of the fentanyl that's being trafficked into this state. We know that. The cartels are killing our kids, and their motivation is pure greed. They don't care about you. They don't care about your families. They don't care about your constituents. And they don't care if they kill a kid or 2 or 20 or 200 or 2,000. All they care about is money. And they're financing their operations, at least in part, through money remitters and money being transferred through those remitters from the United States to Mexico, including from Kansas to Mexico. The amount of money the cartels generate from their drug activities is staggering, as is the amount that they're transmitting through money remitters from the United States back to Mexico. In preparation for this testimony, we looked at estimates from ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Between those 2 estimates, the federal government believes that approximately $58.5 billion in remittances are sent from the United States to Mexico every year. 58.5 billion. Now that's all remittances. Government estimates are that between 7.5% of those and 10% of those are cartel money laundering activities. Now, if you hear later this morning from the remitters or their industry, they're going to tell you that they offer a safe and reliable way to transfer money from the United States to other countries. And that's true. And they will probably tell you that the majority of those transactions are legitimate transactions. And that's true. The vast majority, between 90% and 92.5%, are legitimate. But between 7.5% to 10% are not. Those are the cartels, and that's the money that we're going after because it's proceeds from the drugs that are killing our kids. If you take 7.5% to 10% of $58.5 billion, that gives you between $4 and $6 billion a year that the cartels are sending to Mexico using these wire remitters. Now, how does this work? I wish it were as obvious as somebody walking into a remitter's office wearing a t-shirt that says, "I'm a drug dealer." That would make our lives much easier. But that's not how it works. Somebody walks into a wire, and to be clear, we're not talking about banks and credit unions or their wire transfers of funds. We're talking about money remitters, Western Union, MoneyGram, RIA, things like that. That's what we're talking about. This legislation was crafted very carefully and in conjunction with folks in the industry to make sure banks and credit unions aren't impacted, cash apps aren't impacted. We're just talking about the money remitters. The way that it works is someone walks into a money remitter and says, "I have this cash and I would like to send it to a certain person in Mexico." The money gets sent. It's that simple. A bank account isn't required on either end, and that's why you might hear from the industry that they are helpful to people who are unbanked. And that's true. Again, we're not talking about the majority of the business they do that's completely legitimate. We're talking about how the cartels are using this industry. We know that the cartels are using what we call straw men, or mules, or cutouts. Those might be people involved with drug activity, but likely they're not. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples that we have seen here in Kansas just within the last year of how this works. But often what happens would be the cartel would give a large sum of money to this cutout or mule, whether it's $10,000, $25,000, $100,000. They give the money to this cutout and say, transfer this money to this person in Mexico. And what they do is they break it down into a lot of smaller transactions and then use a number of different money remitters to send all of that cash across the border. A person working for the cartel on the other end goes into the money remitter shop, probably in some small village in Mexico, receives all of those remittances, bundles them back up, and delivers the money to the cartel. This avoids the IRS, it avoids customs, it avoids DEA, it avoids Homeland Security investigations, it avoids all of that scrutiny, and it is a very effective way to move drug proceeds from the United States back to Mexico. Unfortunately, it's happening all around us. We put one example in our written testimony. This is from a case that's currently being prosecuted in the Western District of Missouri, but it involves a total of 42 defendants who were charged in a large conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and fentanyl. 3 women from Kansas City were running money remitter businesses, and they were charged with money laundering. On July 1st of last year, a woman named Lilia Leal Martinez pled guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering. And 4 months ago, in October of 2024, she was sentenced to 35 months in federal prison for her part in the larger drug distribution ring, her role being to launder drug proceeds by sending them through her wire remitter business from Kansas City to Mexico. Between January of 22 and June of 22, she admitted that she remitted these money transfers in the amount of $83,850, broken down into many smaller transactions. 2 other women have pled guilty in the case and are pending sentencing. That was their role in the drug conspiracy. On Friday, after written testimony was due, I learned of another case, this one charged in federal court down in Wichita. 16 defendants in this case are charged with a conspiracy to distribute meth and fentanyl in Kansas. 3 of those 16, 2 men and a woman, their involvement was to launder the proceeds of that fentanyl and meth ring by transmitting it through money remitter businesses from the U.S. back to Michoacan, Mexico. A woman named Angel Garcia, just as one example, is alleged to have transmitted almost $100,000, usually in amounts as low as $380 or $390, sometimes as much as $1,500 or $2,000, between February of 22 and December of 2023. Another woman, Katia Navarez, is alleged, again, these are allegations in the indictment, she's alleged to have transmitted a similar amount, $100,000 total, in amounts between $1,000 and $2,500 between May of 2022 and September of 2023 in Wichita. And a gentleman named Santiago Rodriguez is alleged to have transmitted approximately $60,000, mostly in amounts between $500 and $2,500 between January of 22 and August of 23, again from Wichita, back to Michoacan, Mexico. All of that drug proceeds, all of it being laundered through these money remitter transmissions. Now, will this fee stop that activity? No, unfortunately it won't. But what it will do is it will capture a certain percentage of funds from this constant stream of money flowing south across our border and allow law enforcement to use that money to combat those very organizations that are using this as a mechanism in their profit scheme that's killing so many of our young people. This is the bill that's been carefully drafted here has been patterned after a law that already exists. It's already on the books in Oklahoma, as well as model legislation from ALEC. Now, specifically, what are we asking for? We're asking for a fee of 1.5% on any transfer greater than $500, or a flat fee of $7.50 on any transaction less than $500. The way the bill was drafted, and this goes directly, I believe, to a question asked by Representative Williams, who I think, like me, is trying to get her caffeine level into the therapeutic range still at this time of day. This would not impact any legitimate transactions because of that tax credit. And the chairman is correct. The idea behind the credit is you get a receipt when you make the transfer. It's just like everything else on your taxes, you stick that in the envelope, and when you file your taxes, you have that receipt. You get a credit for all of the fees that you've paid. So if you have a Social Security number or an EIN and you file your taxes, you get a credit back for any of those fees that you've spent. That's the way, in my view, we avoid substantial impact on legitimate taxpayers and legitimate businesses. It was drafted to specifically exclude banks, credit unions, ACH transfers, and cash apps. We're focusing specifically on the money that we know the cartel is sending via these wire remitters. Now, what do the companies say? The opposition testimony went up this morning, so I haven't had a great deal of time to review it. But what I see in the opposition testimony is an argument that this fee imposes a significant burden on Kansas customers and businesses. I respectfully disagree. The argument that paying a fee, keeping your receipts, and later getting credit for the fees that you paid, the argument that that somehow harms the taxpayer, I respectfully submit, pales in comparison to the underlying criminal activity that we're trying to address here. Is it inconvenient? Perhaps. Is it a harm? Maybe you could view it that way. The reason that I began my testimony by explaining the magnitude and scope of this problem is to illustrate what we're dealing with and what we're trying to combat. And the harm to consumers that results, again, I respectfully submit that pales in comparison to the underlying criminal activity. There's an argument that it favors some types of financial institutions such as large banks. Again, I respectfully disagree. Banks are subject to strict controls and monitoring. And one of the reasons that we're seeing the cartels use money remitter businesses is that those businesses, the money remitter businesses, aren't subject to the same controls. If the money remitter businesses want to be subject to the same controls that the banks are, we can talk about that, right? But right now, to say that it favors those larger financial institutions, I submit ignores the fact that those institutions have parameters in place that significantly limit this kind of activity. And that's why the cartels are using them. I see an argument that it would harm law enforcement efforts to combat money laundering and other illicit activity. I'm always a little confused when folks outside of law enforcement talk about how some sort of measure is going to harm law enforcement. As somebody who's working very hard to combat these organizations on a daily basis here in Kansas, I have a hard time seeing how this sort of fee would harm our ability to do that. Is there a theoretical chance that this fee could push money toward other, even less regulated financial remitters like hawalas? I think that's speculation. I think if you look at what's happened in Oklahoma, the one place where we see this type of statute in effect, I'm not aware of any facts or data that support that. Another argument is that it disrupts efforts to harmonize money transmission regulation. I don't, candidly, I don't know what that means. But again, the reason that I set the table here the way that I did is to illustrate for you the magnitude of the problem that we're trying to take on. And to the extent there is any disharmony in the regulation that results from this act, I submit that that pales in comparison to what we're trying to accomplish here. The final argument that I saw is concern over constitutionality of the criminal provision. Quite frankly, the criminal provision, in my view, is the least important part of this bill. In the spirit of compromise, if there were a compromise to be made that would get this across the finish line, I would say that's the compromise. You all know more than most what the landscape is in the state right now when it comes to funding very important things. It's difficult. One of those things that needs to be funded is efforts to go after the groups that are distributing this poison in our communities and killing our kids. I respectfully submit to you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this bill gives us that tool. And the trade-off, I submit to you, is a very mild one, and it is worth our time and it is worth our effort. I stand for questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director. Committee, do we have any questions? Representative Roser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to preface by telling the KBI thank you for the data. It couldn't have been, it had to have been costly and hard to come by. So thank you for providing that for us. I wanted to ask you a couple questions. The first is, what is the KBI's relationship with financial institutions and regulators? Because having been in banking for several years, we already have the Bank Secrecy Act, right? So that covers, it's like an umbrella to protect banks against wire risks. We have continued education for wires. I mean, you could ask maybe the KBA or the Credit Union Association how regulated that is. The last time I was a banker, we had money laundering continued ed quarterly. So it's kind of a lot when you add all of the other things that we have continued ed for in banking. It's just, is there a distrust for the OFAC system? I mean, you can't do any sort of banking for any customer, whether that's cashing out a bank with that bank or whether it's opening an account or sending a wire without running an OFAC first. And so with all of the regulatory risks that we have already put on there for bankers, I think you said yourself that they've got quite a few regulations already put in place there. I haven't been a retail banker in a couple of years, but I just have a really hard time seeing justification for charging our international customers with misdemeanors for sending out international wires or receiving international wires. I represent Manhattan, Kansas. We have many, many international students who rely on that to be successful in our community. What is your take on KBI's relationship with financial institutions and the trust or distrust of OFAC system?
So Representative Roser, thank you very much for the question. I want to distinguish the financial institutions from the money business services, because that's who we're talking about in this legislation. The KBI worked very closely with the KBA, with the banks and the credit unions to make sure that their operations are not impacted by this legislation, because you're correct, those banking operations are tightly regulated. Money service businesses, or money business services, I might have gotten that backwards, are not, right? So although you as a banker are familiar with the training that you get in anti-money laundering, that doesn't apply to the wire remitters, right? They don't get that same training. So the wires that you're talking about going from a bank in Manhattan to a bank in Mexico, those aren't covered by this. They're not a part of this. Those transactions are covered by the acts that you mentioned, right? And that's one of the reasons I believe the Bankers Association responded with neutral testimony Whereas last year they were opposed because apparently we didn't make it clear enough last year that we had no intention of impacting banks in any way at all. So although I read the testimony about the KBA's concern over the misdemeanor violation, again, that's the least important part of the bill to me. And if there's a compromise to be made, that's where it should be. But the bankers' argument about their concerns over that misdemeanor charge implied that the banks were somehow impacted by it, and they are not. That's very clear from the way the legislation is drafted, in my view. This doesn't impact the banking industry in any way. This is wire remitters only, money business services.
Yes.
Thank you for that. I haven't read theirs yet. I will look forward to your neutral testimony. But that doesn't cover the international students that I represent in Manhattan. And of course, that are probably in Lawrence and Wichita and Pitt. You know, it's those students rely on international wires to be successful here.
If you're talking about the use of international money remitters, again, I don't see this impacting them. They can still make their transaction. They save their receipt. They get a credit for the receipt at the end of the year. This does not prevent them from doing what they are legitimately doing now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for being here and then for all the data. I think us in this committee, we try to look things in terms of benefits and negatives, and I think you've done a good job of laying out why you think this is beneficial. Just kind of in terms of pros and cons, you specifically called out Oklahoma in your testimony. And I looked at their data and their fentanyl deaths are skyrocketing. If the type of bill that you said was successful for them that you guys are asking for was successful in negating or decreasing the rate of deaths for fentanyl, it's not working in Oklahoma. And then so in terms of negatives, then we're just putting at a minimum a lot of onus on our international students and anybody here. I mean, most people are not going to take that tax credit to be honest, and save their receipts. And so, you know, I am just very, very skeptical that this will lead to any amount of decrease in deaths in fentanyl in Kansas and just really create a big barrier, if you want to respond to that.
I'd be happy to, Representative. Thank you for the opportunity. I don't think it's fair to equate this bill with what's happening in Oklahoma with regard to fentanyl deaths because of all of the other things happening in Oklahoma. Legalization of medical marijuana in Oklahoma has been a disaster. States that legalize cannabis have a higher rate of fentanyl use, they have a higher rate of fentanyl overdose, and they have a higher rate of fentanyl death. That's just a fact. If you look around the country, the states with legalized cannabis, whether recreation or medical, have higher rates of fentanyl use, overdose, death. I think there's much more of a correlation between those two legislative initiatives, right, than there is between their ability to go after organizations using money generated by this fee. So have Oklahoma's numbers gone down? No, but I don't think this statute, in my view, there's not a direct relationship because there's so many other variables, the biggest of which is the legalization of medical marijuana.
Alrighty, Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. And I think you've talked about this. This is going to be region specific, correct? It's
Yes.
just going to be Mexico.
I don't know that we've narrowed it down. I think the fee is on international wire transfers, but if that's something that the committee is interested in, again, if that gets us across the finish line, then I think that's worth pursuing. That's what we're going after, right?
Okay. Well, my question is, and I think you touched on it, is once, if this bill were to become law and put into effect, wouldn't the cartels and their people that are effectuating all of this get wise to this and say, okay, we're going to move it to, I don't know, Canada, somewhere in the Bahamas, they'll set up shop there. I mean, is that a reasonable assumption?
Yes, And I suspect that's the reasoning behind us not making this specific to Mexico, right? I mean, we know what we saw with the cartels when it came to fentanyl importation, manufacture, and distribution. Initially, the fentanyl that was coming into this country was coming from China. The cartels saw the profit available in manufacturing and distributing fentanyl, and they elbowed the Chinese out of the way. So now what we see is fentanyl precursors coming from China to Mexico. That's where the fentanyl is being manufactured and then transported up here across the border. So the cartels are very good at that kind of activity. So I agree with you, we could very easily see this. That's, in my view, the reason to make it an assessment on all international wire transfers and not just Mexico.
Okay. All right, I'll give you that. If that were to happen, though, let's say the worst case scenario, and they shift somewhere else, that doesn't include where this bill. Will the amount of money that's received into the state for these transactions, the 7% or whatever it is, will that offset the additional manpower requirements for state law enforcement or whoever to counteract what we're trying to do here? Will that more than cover it? That's my question. I always look bottom line.
Right. Bottom line is the criminal organizations are always going to have the ability to stay a step ahead of us. We are already devoting tremendous resources to investigating these complex organizations. We're spending the money anyway, right? We have to spend that money. We have to try to keep pace with them. This is just a way to recoup some of that money, right?
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director, for being here today. I think, this is a very serious issue, and I appreciate you bringing this piece of legislation as a solution, just so I can wrap my head around it. Really, the institution of the fee helps you, the KBI, fight against these types of crimes. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Representative Williams. The way we have set this up is it won't be just the KBI that benefits. The way we envision distributing the fund is a certain percentage goes to the Attorney General's office. And initially there was some objection to State Bank Commissioner administering this, so the AG's office has agreed to take over that role, which I think is fitting since they're going to receive some of the benefit. And another portion of it, I think about a quarter, is envisioned to go into a fund that would award grants to local departments that are combating this same kind of activity. So for example, if Garden City sees an influx of fentanyl trafficking, they can apply to the fund for a grant, and we can use this money to assist that local community in trying to take on this problem. So KBI, yes, but not just the KBI, also a Kansas Attorney General's office and funds available for state and local law enforcement.
And can I ask a follow-up? When it comes to, I see there's a criminal aspect to it. The legislation doesn't really give you a tool to help identify those committing these crimes and using wire transfers.
The legislation doesn't. That's on us. I mean, that's our bread and butter. That's what we do, right? And you can see from the charges that have been filed, we are able to identify some of these folks and we are able to go after them. So you're right, ma'am. It doesn't give us a tool to identify. It just gives us the resources for more tools that we, already in our tool belt that we can use on this problem.
And then with the case out of Leawood or in the Kansas City area, how was that flagged? How was that crime flagged? Were they just arrested because they were illegally here, or?
No, so I don't know the specifics of how either of those investigations came about. I do have 22 years of experience as a federal prosecutor, and I can tell you my supposition on it, and that is this was a drug investigation. When you investigate a complex drug organization, one of the things that you want to know is how are they laundering their money? And I suspect that what happened is once they got into the drugs, they figured out this is how they're sending those proceeds back to Mexico. I don't believe this was a front end kind of thing where they saw somebody going into the wire remitter businesses or anything like that. I suspect that once the investigators got into the dope ring, they figured out that's how this dope ring was getting the money back to Mexico.
And they specifically do it in smaller amounts?
They specifically do it in smaller amounts to avoid scrutiny of law enforcement. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, final question, if that's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your perfect world, now, if it was outside of this piece of legislation, how much money do you think from the state you would need to fight and have an additional resource of funding to fight these specific types of crime? If it was just, we leave this whole fee aside, how much do you think would benefit KBI in the state of Kansas in fighting fentanyl that you could receive from the state?
I got away from the idea of sitting on Santa's lap a long time ago. We try to come back with very focused, targeted requests each year saying this is specifically what we want to do. I had another representative who's not in this room come to me earlier in this session and say, hey, if we were to legalize marijuana, how much do you think it would cost law enforcement? And my answer to him was, I'm not trying to obfuscate. I don't want to give you a number that you think I'm trying to scare you away with, but there's things that are really difficult to forecast. With marijuana, for example, one of the things that we don't know is how many, because of people using more marijuana and then driving, how many more drug recognition experts would we need in Kansas if we were to legalize marijuana? Boy, I can't give you an answer to that. How much more, we know that testing marijuana is it's harder on our machines in the lab. We know we would have to replace them more frequently, but I can't tell you how frequently we would need to replace them, right? So if you say, how much money do you need to tackle fentanyl distribution rings in Kansas, it's one of those things that I've never sat down and put a pencil to. I'm sorry, I should, and maybe we can follow up on that later.
Yeah, and if I just could close out, I just think, as we're looking at this, whether this would generate 10 million or 20 million, how impactful would it be if we establish a grant or something just to see how does that help the state of Kansas in fighting these crimes moving forward versus maybe putting this fee on average Kansans who, like are in Representative Rosner's district or elsewhere of trying to limit that fee to be put on folks. So that's why I ask. It's not a trick question, but wanting to help continue to fight and make Kansas safe. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're very grateful for your assistance in that regard, Representative Williams. Thank you very much.
Boy, asking a agency head in the perfect world, how much money do they need? It's very dangerous. I don't think there's a correct answer there. Coach, last question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mativi. Is Kansas in the forefront? Does Missouri, Colorado, Iowa, I know Oklahoma does. If we get into this, do you think the others around us are going to follow us, or are they already doing something about it?
So the only state that I'm aware of that does this is Oklahoma. I think there was an attempt in Louisiana, but it didn't pass. We tried last year and couldn't get it across the finish line. So I think we would be very forward-leaning. We would be on the forefront. I worry about comparing us to our surrounding states when it comes to drug enforcement, because we're now surrounded by states that have legalized marijuana. And although we continue, in my opinion, to avoid that disaster, I'm nervous about drawing comparisons with how other states are doing it. I am very proud of the efforts that we in Kansas are putting into fighting fentanyl and other drugs. We're partnering very closely with the Highway Patrol and our joint fentanyl impact team. The JFIT has brought the feds to the table, and we have federal assistance in ways that we've never had it in this state. We have local departments now joining that task force in ways that we've never seen before. And I'm very proud of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I see this as another way that we can be leading the nation in how we take on this problem.
And, it is such a huge problem that when I look at the fees, I almost think they're too small. So just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative.
All righty. Director Mativi, I do have one question. With the advancements of technology, especially crypto, are we finding that these cartels are using cryptocurrency to move money around more and more these days?
Absolutely. Our guys who work on the streets, the folks that do undercover, are telling me that we're seeing crypto now involved in almost every transaction that we do. It's sort of like, back in the day when we were trying to penetrate a criminal organization, we could get a wiretap order and listen to their phone calls. Well, nobody talks on the phone anymore. Fentanyl is being distributed almost exclusively now on social media. We have an entire series of buys that take place just on Snapchat. So technology is encroaching into this world more and more every single day. And it's not just this. I mean, what's happening with child sexual abuse material in internet crimes against children, the use of AI is just terrifying. So the answer is yes, unfortunately. And this doesn't address that.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't. And that's kind of one of my thoughts on this too, is while this may address this portion of with wire transfers, more and more folks are just going the crypto route to move money around more illegal organizations. Are you aware of any states or any legislation, or is that going to be more of a federal issue on crypto and I guess how we kind of crack down on it being used for illicit purposes?
Yeah, I think before we get there, we're probably going to have to figure out how we address cash apps.
Okay.
And their use in drug transactions. And we specifically avoided that here because we thought this was cleaner, more manageable legislation without the cash app. So it was sort of, we're trying to eat the elephant one bite at a time. But I do see that as sort of the next frontier for us is cash apps and then probably crypto after that.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Director Mativi, I appreciate all the work you guys have done on fentanyl. And I scream this every time you testify in front of a committee I'm at. And we may disagree, of course, on marijuana, and we've had those discussions before. But the work your office is doing on fentanyl is very much appreciated, especially in my community in South Wichita. So I appreciate all the work you guys are putting into that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your kind words. And I very much value our relationship, even though we do disagree on that issue. That's okay. We recognize the help that you provide to us, and we're very grateful for it. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Director. Thank you so much. That's all we have for proponent testimony. Do we have anybody else to wish to speak as a proponent? Seeing none, we will move to neutral testimony. Up first, we have Rock Roller with the Office of Banking Commissioner. Rock, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Hoheisel and members of the committee. It's nice to be in a bigger room today versus Friday. It was a bit crowded. So the Office of State Bank Commissioner, we do regulate money transmitters, and we have since 1967. We're actually long past the days where money transmission was only completed by wire transfer, which is certainly the case back in 1967. So many companies you recognize have a money transmitter license as part of their business. This includes legitimate transactions from companies such as Amazon, Airbnb, Apple, Google, PayPal, and even X, formerly known as Twitter. So even when these companies use a financial institution to conduct their money transmission, they still need a money transmitter license with us as they are a customer of a financial institution. The State Bank Commissioner does not have an opinion about whether it is proper to charge a fee or a tax. You'll hear it called either or on any international money transmission, as we believe this is something that needs to be answered by the legislature. As introduced, we did have some serious reservations about House Bill 2337. I did not hear it formally announced that there would be an amendment, but that amendment would be critical for us to be neutral on this bill. We, in the twilight hours of getting ready for this bill, we did work with the Attorney General and the KBI to get us to the point where we would be neutral, and I'm very pleased to say that we are neutral. One point I do want to mention is Roser? Okay, I'll pronounce it correct this time. She had some concerns about money transmitters if they are completing OFAC and BSA and AML compliance. I want to let you know that we do examine money transmitters about once 1.5 years, which is very similar to what we do with our state banks. And yes, we are checking for Bank Secrecy Act and money laundering. That is actually probably the most important thing that we check on a money transmitter exam. But it's a matter of scale. Money transmitters are completing transactions in the hundred thousands, whereas banks are completing transactions in the hundreds to maybe thousands. So that's one reason why it is extremely important. I want to talk about the amendments that we worked on, because I think as the regulator, I probably have the most experience and understanding of this bill in the entire room. The original definition for money transmitter by wire was going to capture domestic transactions when you do PayPal payments, even Venmo transactions. So we worked on an amendment where it would apply to a Kansan sending money to a foreign country. I had to finagle the definition a little bit so we didn't have a ton of amendments. So not in Kansas, I'm sorry, not in the United States would mean anywhere except for United States, an actual state, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and even military bases overseas. So those are all excluded with the definition that amendment that I proposed. The second amendment that I proposed is to have the Attorney General or KBI's office enforce the Money Transmitter by Wire Act. The reason being is the State Bank Commissioner, we're a fee-funded agency. We do not collect taxes. And whether you call it a tax or a fee, that really seemed to go beyond our typical licensing and examination scope. So we asked that the Attorney General's office take over that responsibility, which they did agree. Finally, there is one amendment that we would like for you to consider that is not in the amended language, and that is a surety bond. A surety bond stands in place if any entity fails to comply with the Money Transmitter Act. Now, money transmitters do not have FDIC insurance. So when we look to a troubled money transmitter, we are looking to something that's called permissible investments. Those are basically earmarked funds. We're also looking at their tangible net worth. And as the final thing that we look to is a surety bond. We have had to use that rather frequently in the last year, more than we would like. And our concern is if we have a troubled money transmitter, it's most likely in trouble with the Attorney General's office as well. So we don't want a situation where the state of Kansas and harmed Kansas consumers are fighting over the same surety bond for coverage. That just doesn't seem right. So I would like to work with the Attorney General's office to get an amendment that would have a separate surety bond. When that does come back in committee, I would hope that that would be reviewed and accepted by the House as well. And with that being said, I will certainly stand for questions.
Thank you, Brock. I think we'll let the next neutral go, and then we'll have you both stand for questions, because she may be able to touch on some of Representative Roser's questions as well. Up next, we have Kelly Van Swol with the Kansas Bankers Association. Kelly, welcome to the committee.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Kelly Van Swol, Kansas Bankers Association. Thank you for the opportunity to be neutral on this bill today. As the director stated, we did work with them from last year's version so that we could come to a neutral spot here. We appreciate that they narrowed the language down and that they took into consideration the big burden of regulation we already have on ourselves as we're doing wires. Banks and credit unions, like Representative Roser talked about earlier, we have a lot of rules we already follow. And most banks won't do a wire unless you're a customer of that bank for that exact reason. There's a lot of fraud rules and oversight we have to do. So we narrow it to our customer base. Now, I do have one concern with the legislation, which is new Section 6, which creates the misdemeanor crime of an unlawful transmission of a wire transfer. I'm concerned about the potential liability it could open the banks up to. I could see how it maybe wouldn't directly be applied to the bank, but currently banks do not have the obligation to turn away a potential customer based upon citizenship or residency status. So for example, if someone from Canada is in Kansas for the week and wants to go to a bank and open up an account and wire money, there's nothing under current law that stops that. But I worry that this would make that a misdemeanor for that person. So that's my concern there, but happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Appreciate that, Kelly. Committee, we will open up questions for both Kelly and Brock. Representative Roser, did you have one for Brock?
No, it was just a statement because he brought up the OFAC thing. I was a banker, so I ran OFAC probably 45 to 75 times a day. So yes, I understand the regulations that you are under.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Committee, do we have any questions for Brock or Kelly? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close neutral testimony. Open up opponent testimony. We have up Eli Rosenberg, Money Services Business Association via WebEx. Eli, are you with us?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Great. Well, good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. As the Chairman said, my name is Eli Rosenberg. I'm an attorney and I'm a Kansas law graduate, and I'm here today representing the Money Services Business Association, also known as the MSBA. The MSBA is a trade association. It's the largest trade association that represents money service businesses. Money service businesses are non-bank financial entities that are licensed entities at both the federal and state level, and they provide many services to the consumers in the state of Kansas. Just some examples of the products that MSBs provide are remittances that we've been discussing today, low dollar amounts that individuals in the U.S. may send to their home country, bill payments, money orders, and prepaid cards. Our companies are highly regulated and supervised. As money transmitters, they are licensed by the Office of the State Bank Commissioner of Kansas, and they're registered as money services business with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. And as registered MSBs with FinCEN, I think it should be noted and pointed out that money services businesses are required to implement anti-money laundering, Bank Secrecy Act compliance programs that are very similar, virtually identical to those that are operated by financial institutions today. I'm here today on behalf of the association to respectfully express our opposition to HB 2337 and help to demonstrate some of the adverse effects that this legislation would have and its unintended consequences. We believe the bill will hurt Kansas consumers, business, and law enforcement, and not bring about the desired outcomes. First, we believe the bill will negatively impact Kansas consumers. A couple of examples to help demonstrate that point. As has been noted a couple times, Kansas is home to a well-renowned education system. I myself, as I noted, I'm a product of that education system, both through my undergraduate and my law school studies. Students that are traveling to study abroad in Kansas have tuition payments and expenses. Students coming to Kansas to study, medical students in the University of Kansas, as well as military personnel and their families, all regularly send money back home, as well as those who are affected by wars like the current conflict in Ukraine and those affected by natural disasters. So while some may believe that the bill would only affect undocumented immigrants or those who don't pay taxes, that is incorrect. The average taxpayer in Kansas will be negatively affected because they will lose money in the short term. And in the long term, we believe the administrative process of retaining, documenting transaction records will significantly increase the cost to these consumers to initiate transactions and send needed money back to relatives overseas. MSBs are used for these services for many reasons as opposed to banks. Money services businesses provide consumers with flexibility to send money when it is needed. For example, after hours, for a shift worker. In most cases, domestic financial institutions aren't set up to pay a person in another country in local cash or currency. In addition, many of the people in the receiving country simply don't have access or may not have access to a financial institution or a bank account at all. And so money services businesses fill an important role in completing these transactions. So second, we believe the bill would negatively impact Kansas businesses. As I mentioned earlier, money service businesses are highly regulated by the state of Kansas, but they're also highly regulated at the federal level as well, both through their requirements for anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing by FinCEN and by consumer regulators like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The CFPB in 2010 implemented the remittance transfer rule. These regulations are very prescriptive and detailed about the information that a consumer must receive on their receipt, both before and after they initiate a remittance transfer, as well as many other requirements. Adding a tax to this process will require many Kansas businesses, particularly retail businesses, like large grocery chains or small neighborhood convenience stores, or smaller businesses like gas stations and local community stores to incur additional costs and expenses in order to make accommodations to incorporate this new tax. Many of these businesses also rely on legal immigrant labor to support their businesses, and the tax would be very harmful to those individuals as well. A few examples of these areas that these businesses would need to change in response to the bill include updates to their point of sale systems in order to provide appropriate updated receipts, training for employees to distinguish between transactions being sent internationally from domestic transactions, along with changes to store signage and store websites. Many retail businesses know that customers come in for a particular service and then purchase other items as well. Those small businesses rely on the consumer to purchase those additional products or services when coming into their store. The added expense imposed by the bill would push consumers to other alternatives and thus limit additional purchasing powers in stores and the receipt of things like sales tax. Third, the bill will result in fewer monitored transactions, thereby limiting the ability of law enforcement to track funds. As I've mentioned, money service businesses are subject to very stringent federal laws that require the implementation of Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering programs. They are also required to conduct OFAC checks on individuals as well. MSBs work very closely with law enforcement at the federal, state, and local level to implement and achieve these compliance obligations. The requirements imposed on the industry by FinCEN are thus extremely robust. They're virtually identical to the same requirements that are imposed on banks. MSBs continually monitor transactions that are processed to look for trends and abnormalities. They do and are required to file suspicious activity reports, which are critical tools that law enforcement uses to support the identification of criminal activity or contribute and connect to an ongoing criminal investigation. The costs imposed by the new tax may encourage residents to turn to unregulated and unmonitored channels to transmit money, such as cryptocurrency that was mentioned earlier. Licensed money transmitters are, by contrast, subject to extensive oversight by state and federal authorities and must comply with detailed transaction record keeping and reporting requirements, as well as strict anti-terrorism and anti-money laws and regulations. In fact, the FBI recently released an alert warning Americans to avoid using any money transmitter service that is not provided by a registered money services business. In 2023 alone, money service businesses issued approximately 60,000 SARs to assist law enforcement in the state of Kansas. Also of note, in a study performed in 2016 by the Government Accounting Office that looked at anti-money laundering activity, law enforcement was not supportive of any actions that would send money underground using informal mechanisms that would lose the ability for law enforcement to monitor illicit activity and visibility into transactions. Any international remittance tax could hamper law enforcement's efforts to counter crime, money laundering, and foreign terrorism funding by changing customer behaviors and shifting activity away from licensed and regulated money transmitters that I've said are subject to stringent federal requirements to monitor and report on these transactions. Fourth, the bill does impose a tax particularly on unbanked and underbanked residents of Kansas. The most recent results released by the FDIC in 2023 noted that the state of Kansas has 3.4% of its constituents that fall into the unbanked or underbanked category. This population particularly relies on money service businesses to provide day-to-day financial needs. MSBs provide consumers with remittance services, bill payments, money orders, and other products that help them manage their finances. Adding an additional tax, we believe, would have a significant impact on these individuals and their families, a population that is most vulnerable and most affected by the tax. Fifth, and in summary, the bill increases costs for consumers and businesses in Kansas, which we believe does not adequately consider what those increased expenses that companies operating in Kansas would incur, including updates to changes in their policies, their procedures, their point of sale systems, as well as just the necessary procedures to collect, report of those funds. So with that, Mr. Chairman and the committee, I really want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity, albeit via WebEx, up here just a little bit north of you guys in Nebraska, to express on behalf of the Money Service Business Association our opposition and concerns with the bill. Again, the products and services that our members deliver in Kansas are highly regulated at the state and federal level, and we believe deliver safe and reliable products for Kansas consumers and others. We regularly partner with law enforcement and hope to play a pivotal role in helping to fight crime and address many of the issues that have been identified today. So we respectfully submit that the bill on its face will impose a burden on consumers and businesses alike, and are therefore opposed to it. I want to thank you all very much for your time this morning. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Eli. I believe we do have at least one question. Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony today. I'm the mom of 7 young adults, 4 of whom have worked and studied abroad, and all 7 of them have played abroad. And one of the things I can tell you is that there's a lot of anxiety when your children are that far away, and yes, they have their own money, but if their ATM card gets stolen, if they, lose their phone or what have you, for Apple Pay or something like that, it's very disconcerting not to have more money options. So like typically if my child would need money overseas, I can use USAA, but if they've lost their debit card and access to their accounts as well, that creates a problem. So I'm concerned about the burden and the extra cost to try to take care of our Kansas kids and our military overseas. Do you see that that is a possible outcome of this bill?
Yes, thank you, Representative. Yeah, absolutely, right? So, that's a great example of an unintended consequence is someone with family overseas that has an emergency need to get them funds, and for whatever reason, some of the other avenues that we've talked about are unavailable. That they've lost a bank card, and so there's no way to get them funds through a depository institution, or maybe a Cash App doesn't support it. In those instances, you may find yourself, in a Western Union office, right, sending money to be delivered to a local branch in that country, and that would be impacted by this bill.
Committee, do we have any further questions for Eli? Vice Chair Steens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation, and KBI also, and Mr. Rosenberg and our neutral testimony people. I just have a quick question. What about, I know we're talking about, the majority of these are legit people and students and others that are using these wire transfers, but what would you say about the untaxed income that we're not getting? So if you have people that are wiring the money like the cartels, or the maybe illegal people that are here working and they're wiring that money, not paying taxes, and all of the costs that we have for these investigations when it comes to criminal acts, when it comes to healthcare and other things and services that people are using. So, I see both sides to this because I'm listening to our KBI people say, all the money who knows how much money this is costing. And I realize this is just one small avenue, but we know that illegal activities are being done, these kind of transactions are taking place. So what would you say with it as far as recouping some of that untaxed income? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess with respect to, I assume you mean if there are undocumented persons that may be using a service to send. Correct. Well, so I guess I can't speak to what sort of untaxed income those individuals may otherwise be subject to in the state. For example, if they are buying goods and services and paying sales tax or things of that nature. I think our view would be that, whatever potential recoup there would be on tax income from undocumented persons in the state would be outweighed by the additional tax and burden on other residents of the state who are paying taxes, right, and are either documented legal immigrants or just residents of the state in general.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering if I could ask the director of the KBI to step back up. I have a quick question.
Let's, 1 second before we do that, let's see if there's any more for Eli, and then we can let him go, and then we'll have the director step back up for you. Is there any more questions for Eli? Seeing none. Okay, Eli, we're good with you, sir. Thank you for appearing today and testifying.
All right, thank
Representative
you. I
Weigel.
appreciate it.
Yep, Representative Weigel, yes, Director Mativi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we're talking about fentanyl, I don't, does the KBI keep statistics of drug seizures within the state, from the local law enforcement, city, county, troopers?
I wouldn't say we keep them, but I can get them for you.
I'd appreciate that. How much is being seized, and under something that I'm a little familiar with, the drug tax assessment, how much of that is, how much of the drug tax assessment is related to fentanyl? If you could find that out for me.
Sure. So I'll tell you, the patrol tends to keep track of how much fentanyl they seize out of highway interdictions. We're seizing a majority of ours right now in package interceptions. And we can easily put those together and get an idea for you. And I'll get with you after the meeting and figure out specifically what it is you're looking for, and we'll be happy to get it for you, Representative.
I'd appreciate that.
Glad to.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sir. All right, committee, we have two other neutral testimonies. They're written only. Danielle Hologram with the Executive Director of the Kansas Society of CPAs, and Adam Flesher, Counsel to the Money Services Roundtables. Anybody else wish to speak as an opponent today? Seeing none, we will go ahead and close the hearing on HB 2337. All right, committee, today's the last day we can work bills before turnaround. And bills that do not get worked today die unless they are blessed by the speaker. So what I'm going to do is, in the interest of giving the committee a say in what direction they want to go with this, I am going to make a motion to suspend the rules to work HB 2337. Now, that motion to suspend the rules is a 2/3 vote of this committee. I have to have 2/3 vote in order to suspend the rules to work this today. Now, it doesn't mean the bill necessarily dies, because there's a chance, if we can figure something out, I can go to the speaker and try to get it blessed, although the speaker has been pretty insistent on he is not blessing much of anything this year. So I'm going to give the committee a say in what direction we want to go with this. So I will formally make the motion that we suspend the rules for the purpose of working HB 2337 today. I need a second. Seconded by Vice Chair Steens. We will open up for discussion. First off, Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have consistently been frustrated with the timeliness of getting testimony to prepare for this meeting. I live an hour away, a Monday morning commute in rush hour, especially with weather today, is prohibitive. And it's the practice of this committee to not make any testimony available to us until 7 a.m. the morning of the committee. So in my experience, other committees don't operate in this way. I would be very, very uncomfortable going forward with this motion, because I think we owe it to the people who would be impacted by this legislation to give it a serious consideration, to have time to prepare adequate amendments. And, this is just the latest instance of this body rushing things through. When you rush, you make mistakes. So I am uncomfortable with this.
Okay. Any further discussion? Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually not opposed to looking at this idea further. I think if there was a magic bullet where we could pass something and it reduces or eliminates fentanyl deaths in the state, I think we all would do that. I genuinely don't see any evidence that this would do that. I think the most likely outcome, if we do pass this now without more thought, is that many of these people would just use different types of money transmission methods that are far harder to track, actually, crypto, for example. And so I just think this needs a little bit more time to think about, and the bill doesn't die, right? It would stay in committee, and then we can just kind of roll it over to next year, or maybe study it in the interim. But I don't see a need for us to do it now.
Coach.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'd probably vote no, but I'd like to send it on to the body to let them hear everything. Because I think it's such a big problem that we have in the state of Kansas. If it can help, I'm all for it. So I'll vote yes on passing it to the body.
Representative Neely.
I just wanted to echo that, what you just said, but also to point out that we're not attempting to stop the transactions. Actually, what we're accomplishing is giving our law enforcement funds and tools and the ability to fight the fentanyl crisis. That's the way I look at this bill, and I will be voting yes for it.
And my revisor was also just telling me to keep in mind that if it goes below the calendar, which would be us kicking it out today, and then it doesn't get worked this week, it's stricken from the calendar and it's dead. Whereas if it stayed in committee, and we could possibly maybe get it blessed if that's the will of the speaker, and certainly not saying that's a guarantee, because again, he's pretty much cracking down on blessings of bills. That's an avenue. So that was just what the revisor was telling us there. Any further discussion? I see Representative King.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll be voting no on this. I have 3 colleges in my district, and they are going to have international students, and I would want to get them to weigh in on that as well. So again, I would, again, not killing this by any means, but by having further discussion on it.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I agree. I would like to see the amendments too that the neutral testimony talked about. I think I don't know if Jason has those prepared for today or not, but if, Mr. Chair, I think you have a pretty good relationship with the speaker. You can try to talk to him and persuade him to allow this committee to continue to work it and make this bill a good product that we can proudly present on the floor. So I will be supporting a motion against your motion, but hopefully we can continue to work this out and make it a good bill.
I understand. I will, if it's the will of the committee, I will add it to the list of bills to be blessed by the speaker. Again, I don't want anybody to think that it's a guarantee that it will be blessed. I don't want somebody to come next week and say, oh my God, it wasn't blessed, you lied to us. Because at the end of the day, that is totally up to the speaker. And so I will certainly put this on a list, and what the speaker does with it from there is his prerogative. That's above my pay grade. Representative Roser, did you have a comment? Nope. Okay. Any further comments? Seeing none, I do have a motion made by myself and seconded, so we will go ahead and take a vote again. It is a 2/3 vote just to suspend the rules. That's all what this vote is. So with that, all in favor, vote aye. All opposed? No. You know, I'm not great at math, but I think the noes do have it. Goodness gracious. So that will stay in committee. Again, I will add this to the list of bills to try to be blessed by the speaker. I think in the meantime, and I'm not sure what the status is of the amendments either. I believe one was just proposed late by OSBC, something that we need to probably get drafted and take a look at as well. So we'll see if we can, I think there is some thought in this committee that this is an idea that we can entertain in the future. Let's just try to work together to get to that point that we can make this a product for our friends at the KBI. Committee, one last piece before we adjourn for the day. I've gotten a lot of inquiries about where we are on the public funds bill, the one that we had with the banks and our local folks. Next Wednesday, our first day back from turnaround, we will hear the second part of the continuation, I guess, because that is actually still, that hearing is still suspended for the time being or paused. We will have folks back in here. We'll be able to ask questions. Hopefully some progress is made. I know there's a meeting coming up towards the end of the week that we hope to pound out some of the disagreements. And hopefully everybody can come back next week and say we found common ground and we can ask our questions. So that will be next Wednesday at 9 a.m. in this room. We will resume that hearing. So just be prepared, have your questions ready. We'll probably turn it to both sides for just a quick 5-minute update of where we are in the negotiations. And the rest of the time, we're just going to ask all the questions we want for the rest of the hour and a half. So have your questions ready and be prepared, and we will see you next Wednesday.